Astyages. The Median Empire was the first Iranian-speaking civilization to build something that genuinely deserved the word empire, centered at the city of Ekbatana, modern-day Hamadan, sitting on a high, cold plateau in northwestern Iran, where the winters bite hard and the mountains make every political decision feel permanent. Astyages was its last king, reigning from 585 to 550 BCE, and his story is one of the clearest examples in ancient history of how cruelty born from fear becomes the very mechanism of a ruler's destruction. According to Herodotus in Book 1 of his histories, the trouble began with a dream. Astyages dreamed that his daughter Mandane urinated so much that the flood covered all of Asia, and his Magi, the priestly class who doubled as political interpreters at the Median court, told him this meant her offspring would one day rule in his place. His solution was to marry her to a Persian nobleman he considered beneath royal status, hoping to dilute the bloodline. Then she became pregnant, and he had another dream, this time that a vine grew from her womb and spread across the entire continent. The Magi interpreted this one the same way. The child would take his throne. Astyages' response to learning his daughter had given birth was to summon his general Harpagus and give him a simple, monstrous order: take the infant and kill it. Harpagus, unwilling to carry out the murder himself, but equally unwilling to defy his king openly, passed the child to a shepherd named Mithridates with instructions to leave the baby exposed on a mountainside. The shepherd and his wife, who had recently suffered a stillbirth, instead raised the child as their own. That child was Cyrus, the future Cyrus the Great, the man who would eventually fold the Median Empire into something far larger. When Astyages discovered years later that Harpagus had not followed his orders, his revenge was not a public execution, not a military demotion, not a political exile. It was an invitation to dinner. He summoned Harpagus to a royal banquet, welcomed him warmly, seated him at the table, and served him a meal. Only after Harpagus had eaten did Astyages have servants bring out a covered dish and lift the lid to reveal the head, hands, and feet of Harpagus' own son, whose flesh had just been served as the main course. Herodotus records that Harpagus maintained his composure, claimed the king's pleasure was his own pleasure, and took the remains home. Whatever he felt inside, he remembered. Years later, when Cyrus raised the Persian tribes in revolt against Median rule, Harpagus defected with a significant portion of the Median army rather than fight for the man who had served him his child at a dinner party. The cruelty did not just wound Harpagus, it handed Cyrus the military defection that made his victory possible. Astyages had also spent his reign weaponizing the Magi as tools of political control, executing or punishing priests whose dream interpretations displeased him, which created a culture of terror even within the religious class that was supposed to legitimate his rule. He taxed the Persians, his vassal people, heavily, and treated them as a subordinate ethnicity rather than a constituent group, which provided Cyrus with a ready population of people who had every reason to want the empire reorganized under new management. When the final battle came around 550 BCE, Astyages' army did not so much lose as dissolve. Soldiers handed their king over to Cyrus rather than fight for him. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian cuneiform text that is one of the most reliable contemporary sources for this period, corroborates the broad shape of these events, including the Median army's defection. Astyages was captured, reportedly treated relatively well by Cyrus, which says more about Cyrus than it does about Astyages, and the Median Empire became the foundation layer of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The story of Astyages is a masterclass in the self-defeating logic of paranoid cruelty. He was so afraid of being overthrown that every act of violence he committed to prevent it created another enemy who would help bring it about. Cambyses II. If Astyages represents cruelty driven by fear, Cambyses II, who reigned from 530 to 522 BCE, represents something slightly different and in some ways more disturbing. Cruelty that seems to have no consistent internal logic at all. Impulsive, contradictory, and operating with the unpredictability that makes a ruler genuinely terrifying to everyone around him. He was the son of Cyrus the Great, inheriting the largest empire the world had yet seen, and he spent his reign systematically burning through the goodwill his father had painstakingly built with subject peoples across the Near East. His conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE was, by military standards, brilliant. He defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium and added Egypt to the Persian Empire in a single campaign. What followed the military victory is where the historical record gets dark and complicated. Herodotus, writing in Book 3 of his histories, claims that Cambyses stabbed the sacred Apis bull, a living animal considered a physical manifestation of the god Ptah in Egyptian religion, in a fit of contemptuous rage at Egyptian religious customs. The story is dramatic and has the ring of the kind of narrative that accretes around hated rulers, and it should be noted that Egyptologists have pointed to an inscription recording an Apis bull dying of natural causes during Cambyses' reign reign, which complicates the picture. What is less disputed is that Cambyses' administration of Egypt was significantly harsher than his father's tolerant model, and that he did not extend to Egyptian religion the same respectful accommodation that had made Cyrus so popular in Babylon. His relationship with violence at court was similarly erratic. He ordered the execution of Croesus, the former king of Lydia, who had been retained as a kind of elder statesman and advisor, according to Herodotus. Then reportedly he regretted the order and flew into a rage when he learned it had already been carried out. Whether the regret was genuine or performative is impossible to know, but the pattern of issuing lethal orders and then becoming furious at their consequences suggests a man whose impulsiveness was so severe it undermined even his own intentions. Before leaving for Egypt, he had his own brother Bardia, also known as Smerdis in Greek sources, secretly killed, apparently fearing that a capable male relative left behind in Persia would attract the loyalty of would-be usurpers. He then kept the death secret, which meant that when a man claiming to be Bardia seized the throne while Cambyses was still in Egypt, nobody could definitively prove the claimant was not who he said he was. The cover-up created the exact crisis the murder was meant to prevent. Herodotus also describes him ordering 12 Persian noblemen to be buried alive head first, which if accurate places him among the more inventive practitioners of judicial murder in the ancient record. He reportedly killed his own sister wife, either by a deliberate kick to her pregnant abdomen or by direct order depending on which version of the source you consult, and the ambiguity between deliberate kick and ordered execution is not as comforting as it might sound. His military ambitions extended beyond Egypt to an attempted attack on the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa Oasis deep in the Sahara, and an army of approximately 50,000 soldiers was sent on this campaign. They were never heard from again. Ancient sources attribute the loss to a catastrophic sandstorm, and while no peer-reviewed archaeological discovery has conclusively located the remains of this army, despite a claimed discovery in 2009, the disappearance of an entire military force in the desert is the kind of event that tends to make it into the historical record regardless of embellishment. Cambyses died in 522 BCE from an accidental wound to the thigh while mounting his horse in Syria, rushing back to deal with the false Bardia's usurpation. Ancient sources, with what reads like deliberate irony, noted he was wounded in the same part of the body where he had stabbed the Apis bull. Whether that detail is literally true or a piece of moral storytelling retrofitted onto the facts, it is exactly the kind of ending history generates for rulers like Cambyses. An accidental, undignified death in transit, chasing a problem his own cruelty had created. Xerxes I. The Achaemenid dynasty spans roughly 220 years, from Cyrus the Great's consolidation of power to the final defeat by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE, and it is long enough and varied enough that it earns 2 entries on this list, because the cruelty of Cambyses and the cruelty of Xerxes are so categorically different that collapsing them into a single entry would miss something important. Xerxes, who reigned from 486 to 465 BCE, was not impulsive in the way Cambyses was. His evil, if we are going to use the word plainly, was colder, more deliberate, and more ideological. Where Cambyses erased cultures almost accidentally, in the throes of contempt and mood, Xerxes did it as policy. When Egypt revolted shortly after he took the throne in 46 BCE, he suppressed the revolt and then methodically stripped Egypt of the administrative privileges and religious accommodations his father Darius had granted it, downgrading it from a respected satrapy to an occupied territory and looting temple treasuries that had been protected under Persian rule. When Babylon revolted around 482 BCE, his response was even more consequential in the long arc of history. He reportedly melted down the golden statue of Marduk, the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, whose ritual handling by the king each new year was the religious act that legitimated rule over Babylon. The destruction of that statue was not a military necessity. It was a message: your gods do not protect you from me. Some scholars dispute the extent of the destruction, and the archaeological evidence is ambiguous enough that the claim should be noted as contested. But what is not contested is that Babylon lost its status as a royal city under Xerxes, and never fully recovered its political centrality. His invasion of Greece, launched in 480 BCE, brought the largest army the ancient world had yet seen across the Hellespont via a bridge of boats nearly a mile long, and his burning of Athens, including the Acropolis and its temples, went beyond any military calculation. The Persians had already won the battle for the city. The population had evacuated. Burning the temples was a choice, a deliberate act of cultural erasure directed at a civilization he had decided to make an example of. Herodotus, in Book 7, describes one of the more psychologically revealing moments of his reign. When a storm destroyed the first pontoon bridges being built across the Hellespont, Xerxes ordered the strait itself whipped with 300 lashes, had fetters thrown into the water to symbolically chain the sea, and executed the engineers responsible for the failed bridges. Punishing a body of water and beheading the men who failed to control it in the same administrative breath is the action of a man who genuinely believed the natural world owed him obedience, and dealt out death when that obedience was not delivered. He then commissioned new engineers who presumably built the replacement bridges with a fairly vivid understanding of the professional consequences of failure. His court was a place of factional violence throughout his reign, and in 465 BCE he was assassinated in his own bedchamber by his courtier Artabanus, possibly in conspiracy with his son Artaxerxes. The man who had whipped the sea and burned temples was killed in his bed by someone who walked past his guards. The distance between those two images, the emperor who punished the ocean and the man murdered in his own room, captures something true about the nature of power built on terror rather than loyalty. Antiochus IV Epiphanes. After Alexander the Great destroyed the Achaemenid Empire in a campaign between 334 and 330 BCE, the territory that had been Persia was carved among his successors, and the Seleucid dynasty took control of the Iranian and Near Eastern core, ruling from Syria with an ambition to Hellenize, to make Greek in culture and custom every territory they governed. Antiochus IV, who ruled from 175 to 164 BCE, took that Hellenizing project and transformed it into something that no political program should ever become: a persecution. He became one of the most reviled figures in Jewish religious history, a man whose actions were so transgressive that they left a permanent mark on both Judaism and, through the Book of Daniel's prophetic echoes, on early Christianity as well. His military career was initially successful. His Egyptian campaigns in 170 and 168 BCE were going well until a Roman envoy named Gaius Popilius Lanus intercepted him near Alexandria, drew a circle in the sand around him, and told him to make a decision about withdrawing from Egypt before he stepped outside the circle. Rome had spoken. Antiochus withdrew. The humiliation of being told by a single diplomat with no army present that his conquest was over apparently required an outlet, and he found it in Judea. He had already plundered the temple treasury in Jerusalem once. He returned with the energy of a man who needed to prove something to himself. He banned Jewish religious practice under penalty of death, making circumcision, Sabbath observance, and public Torah study capital offenses across his territory. He desecrated the Second Temple in Jerusalem by sacrificing a pig on the altar, an animal that Jewish law classified as unclean, and installed a statue of Zeus inside the sacred space. The Book of Daniel and later Jewish sources refer to this as the abomination of desolation, and the phrase is not hyperbole in context. The deliberate, systematic inversion of a religion's most sacred practices, enforced with executions, was a genuine attempt to make a people stop being what they were. The books of 1 and 2 Maccabees, which are the primary Jewish sources for this period, and which historians cross-reference with non-Jewish accounts from Polybius and Livy, describe mothers who had their sons circumcised, being executed with their infants tied around their necks. These accounts come from religious texts with devotional intent and may contain elements of rhetorical amplification, but the core pattern of violent persecution is corroborated across multiple independent sources. His actions triggered the Maccabean Revolt in 167 BCE, one of the first recorded religious wars in history, in which a family of Jewish priests, called the Maccabees, led a guerrilla campaign against Seleucid forces and eventually recaptured and ritually purified the temple. That recapture is the origin of the festival of Hanukkah, which means that Antiochus IV Epiphanes is, with extraordinary historical irony, the man whose cruelty created one of Judaism's most beloved celebrations. He adopted the royal title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, and his subjects reportedly called him Epimanes, meaning the mad one, a single letter's difference that his own people clearly felt was the more accurate description. He died in 164 BCE, reportedly in mental deterioration, having failed to crush the revolt he had ignited in the territory of Persia while attempting a military campaign to replenish his treasury by looting temples. Orodes II. The Parthians were an Iranian dynasty, descended from a nomadic people from the steppes east of the Caspian Sea, who rebuilt Persian imperial power after the Seleucids began to fragment. ruling a vast empire from roughly 247 BCE to 224 CE. Most Parthian kings operated as pragmatic rulers managing a decentralized empire, and the historical record is thinner for them than for the Achaemenids, in part because much of what we know comes from Greek and Roman sources with their own perspectives and biases. Orodes II, who reigned from approximately 57 to 37 BCE, stands out not for sustained systemic cruelty so much as for a specific combination of choices that reveal a particular kind of dangerous ruler, one who destroys the people most valuable to him out of envy, and whose behavior normalizes such spectacular violence that it becomes the dynasty's inheritance. He came to power through the assassination of his own brother Mithridates III, who had challenged him for the throne, and the fratricidal foundation of his reign set a tone that his descendants would repeat with tragic consistency. His general Surena, arguably the most gifted military commander in Parthian history, achieved something extraordinary in 53 BCE at the Battle of Keri in modern southeastern Turkey. He destroyed a Roman army led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Rome, killing approximately 20,000 Roman soldiers and capturing another 10,000 in one of the most catastrophic defeats Rome ever suffered. Surena accomplished this with a cavalry force and a revolutionary use of mounted archers who wore down the Roman legions in the desert heat, a battle that echoed through Roman military thinking for generations. Orodes' response to this historic victory was to have Surena executed. The stated reason varies by source, but the most plausible reconstruction, supported by Plutarch's account in his Life of Crassus, is that Orodes was jealous of the fame Surena had accumulated, and feared that a general celebrated as the savior of Parthia might have ambitions beyond generalship. Killing your most brilliant commander immediately after his greatest achievement is a particular category of evil, because it is not just the destruction of one man. It is the signal sent to every capable person in the empire about the ceiling above which it is dangerous to rise. Plutarch's account of the aftermath of Keri includes one of the most grimly theatrical images in ancient history. Orodes was reportedly at his court watching a performance of Euripides' play, The Bacchae, when the severed head of Crassus was brought in as a trophy. In the climactic scene of that play, the character Agave holds up the head of her son Pentheus, whom she has killed in a Dionysiac frenzy, mistaking him for a lion. According to Plutarch, an actor used Crassus's actual head as a prop for that scene, and the court applauded. Whether this story is literally accurate or whether it is the kind of image that attached itself to the event because it was too resonant to resist, it has been preserved across the centuries as a distillation of what Orodes' court represented. A place where severed heads were entertainment and the line between theatrical violence and actual violence had effectively disappeared. Orodes was eventually killed by his own son Phraates Fear, who then systematically murdered approximately 30 of his brothers to eliminate rival claimants to the throne, a method of succession planning that Orodes' own example of fratricidal politics had normalized. The cruelty he practiced and permitted cascaded forward into the next generation with mathematical inevitability. Shapur II. The Sasanian Empire was the last pre-Islamic Persian dynasty, a powerful and culturally sophisticated Iranian state that ruled from 224 CE to 651 CE, and treated the Roman and later Byzantine empires as its equals and competitors across 3 centuries of intermittent warfare, diplomacy, and mutual cultural exchange. Shapur II has the distinction of the longest reign in Sasanian history, 70 years from 309 to 379 CE, a span made more remarkable by the fact that he was declared king before he was born, crowned in the womb after his father's death, with the crown placed on his mother's abdomen, according to tradition. He grew into one of the most formidable military rulers Persia ever produced, and also one of its most systematic persecutors of religious minorities, a combination that Persian national tradition has historically celebrated by calling him Shapur the Great, while largely setting aside the second half of that equation. His persecution of Christians in Persia was not born from simple religious hatred, which does not make it less horrific, but gives it a political logic that is important to understand. When the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and made it the favored religion of the Roman Empire, Persian Christians became politically suspect in Shapur's eyes, potential sympathizers with Persia's primary imperial rival. The reasoning was cold and strategic. Loyalty to a Roman god could mean loyalty to Rome. The implementation was savage. Beginning around 340 CE and continuing through much of his reign, Shapur authorized and directed systematic persecution of the Christian community in Persia, targeting clergy first and then laity, backed by a policy of doubling the tax burden specifically on Christian communities. When the Christian leader Simeon Bar Sabai refused to collect this double tax from his community, he was arrested. He was subsequently martyred along with a large group of clergy, with with some Syriac martyrological sources recording the execution count from this event alone as exceeding 100 people, though hagiographic sources of this period write with devotional rather than documentary intent, and specific numbers should be understood in that context. The broader pattern of persecution across Shapur's reign is corroborated by multiple independent sources, and is accepted by historians as a genuine sustained campaign against a religious minority, rather than isolated incidents. His military career ran parallel to this domestic persecution. He besieged the critical border city of Nisibis, in what is now southeastern Turkey, 3 separate times, in 337, 346, and 350 CE, in prolonged campaigns that tested Roman defensive capacity to its limits. He was ultimately successful in the larger strategic game. The peace treaty negotiated in 363 CE after the death of the Roman Emperor Julian, during a failed Persian campaign forced Rome to cede Nisibis, and a substantial territory of strategic fortresses to Persia, one of the most humiliating treaty agreements Rome signed in the 4th century. His treatment of captured enemies could include what ancient sources describe as hamstringing, disabling prisoners to prevent escape before deciding their fate, and the use of captives in forced labor under conditions that amounted to death sentences. Despite all of this, Shapur II remains a celebrated figure in Iranian historical memory, which is a useful reminder that greatness and monstrousness are not mutually exclusive categories in the record of any civilization, and that how a ruler is remembered depends enormously on who is doing the remembering. Shah Abbas I. The Safavid dynasty built the political, cultural, and religious framework of what we now recognize as modern Iran. They were Shia Muslim rulers who came to power in 1501, and whose greatest monarch, Shah Abbas I, reigning from 1588 to 1629 CE, constructed the extraordinary city of Isfahan as a showcase of Persian civilization, built the breathtaking blue-tiled Imam Mosque that still stands as one of the architectural masterpieces of the Islamic world, reformed the military and administrative structure of the empire, drove back Ottoman and Uzbek encroachments, and restored stability after decades of chaotic civil conflict. He is called Abbas the Great in the standard Persian historical epithet, and he earned that descriptor in the areas of statecraft, urban planning, and military strategy. He also blinded his own sons, executed his heir on suspicion of ambition, governed through a pervasive network of informants that made his court a place of constant low-level terror, and oversaw the forced deportation of tens of thousands of Armenian Christians in a march that killed a significant number of civilians in transit. The capacity of a single reign to contain genuine public achievement and private monstrousness at this scale is what makes Abbas historically fascinating and ethically necessary to examine honestly. His treatment of his own family was the most visible expression of his controlling nature. His eldest son, Safi Mirza, was executed in 1615, after Abbas became convinced, based on information from his court surveillance network, that Safi was building an independent base of support among the military and nobility. 2 other sons were blinded, disqualifying them from succession under Persian political tradition, which held that physical impairment excluded a man from rule. Abbas blinded his own children to eliminate them as threats, then found himself, in the final years of his reign, without a capable heir, a problem of his own direct creation that destabilized the dynasty he had worked so brilliantly to restore. He had also effectively sidelined his own father, Shah Muhammad Qutbanda, in his rise to power, consolidating control through court manipulation at an age when most people are still learning to govern, which demonstrated early that family loyalty was a calculation for Abbas rather than a baseline. His campaigns against the Ottomans and Uzbeks recaptured vast territories previously lost, but the reconquest of areas like the South Caucasus came with severe reprisals against civilian populations in cities that had accommodated the enemy, a pattern common in the era, but intensified under Abbas' particular methodology. The deportation of Armenian populations from the Ararat region, in what Armenian sources call the Surgan, and date primarily to 1604 and 1605, involved the forced relocation of entire communities from their ancestral lands into the Persian heartland, motivated partly by a desire to bring skilled Armenian craftsmen and merchants into the economic core of the empire, and partly by a scorched earth strategy to deny the Ottomans a populated, productive frontier. The death toll of the transit is disputed. Armenian sources have cited figures in the hundreds of thousands, which most historians consider significantly overstated. The economic disruption, demographic trauma, and civilian deaths during the forced marches are well documented in multiple independent sources and are not disputed in their broad reality, even if specific numbers remain contested. The scholar Roger Savory whose work Iran under the Safavids remains the standard English-language academic reference on the dynasty, characterizes Abbas's court as one governed substantially by fear as a political instrument. Abbas died in 1629, having kept the Safavid dynasty alive through sheer force of will and strategic intelligence, but having left it structurally weakened by the very paranoia that drove his governance. Within a century, the dynasty would collapse, and the airless, fearful court culture he had normalized bears a significant part of the responsibility. Aga Muhammad Khan. The Qajar dynasty, which ruled Iran from the late 18th century through 1925, was founded by one of the most systematically brutal rulers in Persian history, a man whose capacity for spectacular violence was so pronounced that even in an era of routine political cruelty, contemporary observers on multiple sides recorded it with something approaching disbelief. Aga Muhammad Khan, who reigned from 1789 to 1797 CE, came to power after decades of civil war that had fragmented Iran among competing tribal and dynastic factions, following the collapse of the Safavids and the brief, violent interlude of the Afsharid dynasty. He was castrated as a child by his political enemies, a mutilation intended to remove him from dynastic competition by eliminating his capacity to produce heirs, and both Persian and Western historians of the period have noted carefully that this formative trauma appears to have organized much of what followed in his adult life, a driven, relentless, and extraordinarily vindictive campaign to dominate everyone and everything within reach. His military reunification of Iran was genuine and consequential. He ended the civil wars, established Tehran as the new capital, and created the administrative foundation that the Qajar dynasty built on for over a century. None of that history dissolves what he did along the way. His campaign against Lutf Ali Khan, the last ruler of the Zand dynasty, was a prolonged pursuit that ended in capture and a punishment Aga Muhammad Khan apparently designed with personal investment. Lutf Ali Khan was blinded, mutilated, and killed after an extended period of deliberate degradation, and multiple sources indicate that Aga Muhammad Khan took something more than strategic satisfaction in the process. When the city of Kerman, which had sheltered Lutf Ali Khan, fell to his forces, his retribution achieved a kind of horrifying grandeur. He ordered the eyes of 20,000 men gouged out. The British diplomat and historian Sir John Malcolm, whose History of Persia remains a key primary source for this period, records this event in detail, and it is corroborated across multiple contemporary accounts, Persian and European, making it one of the better attested mass atrocities of the era. The specific figure of 20,000 may be rounded or approximate, as such figures often are in sources of this period, but the scale of the event is not in dispute. What Aga Muhammad Khan then allegedly had done with the collected eyes, organizing them into a counted pyramid as a monument to his own power, is the detail that has echoed through historical memory as the defining image of his reign. A trophy built from the organs of human sight, stacked carefully to demonstrate the precise arithmetic of his capacity for punishment. His reconquest of Georgia in 1795 culminated in the sack of Tiflis, modern Tbilisi, which involved the systematic destruction of the city, mass killing of the population, and the deportation of approximately 15,000 Georgian civilians into slavery. This figure is corroborated by both Russian and Persian sources from the period and is considered reliable by historians of the Caucasus region. The destruction of Tiflis accelerated Russian imperial interest in the region and contributed directly to the geopolitical realignment that would eventually bring the Caucasus under Russian rather than Persian influence, making his act of brutal retribution strategically self-defeating in the longer arc of history. He was known unusually for overseeing punishments and executions personally rather than delegating them, which speaks either to an appetite for violence as an experience rather than merely a tool, or to a calculated political theater in which the ruler's physical presence at the moment of punishment was itself the message. He was assassinated in 1797 by his own servants. The proximate cause was that he had threatened to execute them the following morning for the minor offense of disturbing his rest by making noise with a watermelon. They killed him in his tent that night, rather than wait. It is an ending that rhymes with the endings of Astyages, Orodes, and Cambyses before him, a ruler so uniformly and indiscriminately cruel that the people physically closest to him eventually calculated that killing him was less dangerous than continuing to serve him. 1,000 years of Persian dynasties, from the Median Plateau to the Qajar court, and the mechanism of self-destruction turns out to be the same every time. The cruelty intended to make a ruler untouchable is the cruelty that eventually puts a knife in his tent. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.